Welcome to the lesson on managing your images. In this lesson, I'm going to start with the Deployment Image Servicing and Management utility, or it's better known as just DISM. Mainly that's because nobody can ever remember what it stands for. But we'll start with DISM basics, and then I want to get into some terminology, because Microsoft has kind of invented some new terms to use in the computer industry that I've never heard used before, so I want to make sure you understand what those are as well. Then I'll show you how to mount an image, get information on images. Maybe you're not the person who created that image. You've been brought in after someone else has created the images or set up the deployment solution, and now it's your responsibility to continue what they have previously put in place. As you'll see, a lot of these DISM commands are really long, and autocomplete doesn't work. So I'm going to show you how to easily create DISM commands. Kind of build a cheat sheet for yourself that you're going to use over and over again. Then we'll wrap up DISM by showing you how to add and remove drivers and packages. The second tool I'll cover in this lesson is the User State Migration Tool, or USMT, and this is version 4.0. I'll show you the processes and the requirements needed for running USMT, and then what is and is not migrated by default, and couple tips and tricks on how to get things migrated that aren't by default, and finish up with how the USMT stores data. First, Deployment Image Servicing and Management, or DISM. For the DISM basics, you can only run DISM on Vista SP1 and later images. Don't even try to run it on an XP or a 2003 image. It's not going to work. Now what you can do with DISM is you can mount and unmount WIM files. That includes WinPEs as well as operating system WIM files. You can add and remove third-party device drivers, language packs. You can even enable, disable, or configure Windows features like setting up firewall exceptions. Lastly, you can add and configure updates or MSUs. But it's very important to remember there is no capture or apply feature with DISM. You still have to use ImageX if you'd like to capture an image or apply an image. So DISM cannot do a capture or an apply. And there's this interesting term used with DISM called image context. When I was reading through the documentation, I came upon this image context and I thought, what in the world is that? So I thought maybe other people might be a little bit confused by this and thought I should probably explain it a little. So I want to tell you what it means to look at an image with context or without context. First of all, you're going to start with an elevated command prompt. Then I'm just going to type in DISM / and get a help file. You'll see that this help file is different than if I give the command an actual context or an image to look at and tell me exactly what help file that image contains. With image context, I could tell it DISM / online and then / for show me the help file and things I can do to the online or the currently running host operating system. Now, don't do it on a WinPE because you're not going to be able to do anything to a WinPE. So this is Windows 7, Server 2008, or 2008 R2, or even Vista machines if you have those. If you have an image that's currently mounted, and I'm going to show you how to mount an image here in just a few minutes. If you have an image that's mounted, you could also point to that mounted image as your context. For the mounted image, you would type DISM / image, tell it the folder you have it mounted in, mount, Win7, and then give it the / and you'll get a different help file than if you just ran DISM / Let me show you how different these are. I'm on my deployment server, and I'm going to launch the Deployment Tools command prompt. Clean things up a bit. If I just type in DISM, show me the help file, scroll back up to the top, you'll see that there's a few things I can do. I can get mounted WIM info, get WIM information. I can commit, unmount, mount, remount, cleanup. I promise I'm going to cover every single one of these. For image specifications, I could point to the online image that's currently running. In this scenario, I'm running Server 2008 R2. That would be my online image. Or if I have an image mounted, I could tell it where the image is mounted. Some of your DISM options. You want the command line output to be in English. That is the default. If you're running in another language and you want it to be in English, you could give it the /English switch. Specify the report output format. And I'm going to be showing you that when we dump information about drivers a little bit later on. There are a couple different formats we can use. You've got the winder that specifies the path to your Windows directory. And then, as you notice, we've got sys drive directory, logging path, logging level, the no restart switch, which is going to suppress your automatic reboots. And /quiet suppresses all output except for error messages. And then your scratch directory. Remember, that scratch directory will be the path to the folder you'd like to use as your scratch directory if your applications need that. Now you saw there wasn't a whole lot I could do there. Watch this. If I now give it a context and tell it, look at the currently running online image and tell me, what's the help file for that? Scrolling, scrolling. There we go. Right back up to our DISM online. Show us the help file. Wow, already. Set product key, set target additions. You can change the additions of a mounted WIM image if you have the correct product keys. And I'm not going to go through every single one of these. We'll be spending a lot of time in this help file. You can apply an unattended answer file, add remove drivers, get driver information. A lot of user interface language settings, time zones. Check for application patches, get application patch information. You can get a list of all your applications, everything that's been installed as MSIs. You can add, remove packages, enable features, disable features, get packages. I'm going to show you quite a few of these here in a bit. But as you can see, you get a completely different help file when you supply an image context. You'll see why that is in just a few minutes. Let's talk about DISM and the image. Now this is an interesting utility. You would think that DISM would run the same way on a Vista image as it would on a Windows 7 or a Server 2008 or Server 2008 R2 image. But you would be wrong. What happens is your DISM providers actually live inside the WIM file, inside the operating system image itself. And the various providers, of course, provide different functionality. So DISM's help file on a Vista machine is going to be different than it would be on a Windows 7 or Server 2008 R2. Your providers are stored in the Windows System32 DISM folder. Now what happens if you walk into an environment and someone else has already set up their deployment solution? You have no idea what is inside those WIM files, but your job is to figure out what's inside those WIM files. Well, getting information on a WIM in the past, we used ImageX, gave it the /info switch, and then told it the path to the image file. For example, if I wanted to get information on a file that lives in the C:\wims folder and is named install.wim, I would type ImageX /info, give it the path and the name of the file. Now we can use DISM. With DISM, the command might be a little bit longer, but it's well worth the typing. With the DISM command, we can tell it DISM /get-wiminfo, and then give it the WIM file, path, and name of the file. For an example, DISM get wiminfo on that exact same file, WIM file. It's in the C:\wims folder, and it's named install.wim. And one of the really cool things is you could just pipe that to a text file, print it off, put it in a book, and call it documentation. I'll show you how different the ImageX and the DISM commands are. And let's do a directory listing. I do have a WIMS folder. Let's go in and find out. We have an install.wim there. All right. Change directories back out. clean up that folder. Let's do image X first. Tell it to give us information on that C:\\, WIMS, \. And if you didn't notice, I'm hitting the Tab key, which does autocomplete with image X. Press Enter. Wow. Let's scroll back up to the top here. All the way back up. Here's our command. First thing that's interesting here is in the image count, this shows that I have 5 images stored in this one install.wim file. Image index number 1, that would be Windows Starter Edition. Notice there's a lot more information in here. There's the number of directories, files, the total bytes, the creation time, high part, low part, last modification, architecture, major, minor build numbers, SP builds, SP levels. We cruise on down, look at image index number 2. That one is Home Basic Edition. Cruising on down, there's image index number 3. That one's Home Premium. Image index 4 is Professional. And the last one, image index number 5, is Ultimate Edition. Now, that's a lot of information to look at. Let me show you how to get the same information using DISM. You'll notice that the DISM commands are not case sensitive, which is nice. Tell it the path that was in the WIMS folder. I'm hitting the Tab key. Guys, autocomplete does not work with DISM. Needs to go on our wish list, right? Because these commands are a whole lot longer and more cumbersome to type, especially with these strange dashes in the middle of the switches, get dash wim info. You'll get used to it, or I'm going to show you how to cheat and not ever have to get used to it here in a few minutes. So here's our DISM command, looking at the exact same install.wim file. Oh, wow, that looks a lot better, doesn't it? We scroll back up to the top. We can see here's our command. And we're looking at the details for this image. Image 1, well, that's Windows 7 Starter. There's the size. Image 2, Home Basic. 3, Home Premium. 4, Professional. 5 is Ultimate. To take this one step further, I'm going to do the exact same command, but I'm going to pipe this to a text file, and I'll just call it WIM-info. I'm going to put it in the root of C, and it's just a basic old TXT file. Then open Notepad. And as you can see, this would be easy enough just to print. Now, if someone has created custom WIM images and put them inside a WIM file, this is where it's really important on what they typed in as the description. Notice the descriptions here. Your description's Windows 7 Starter. Well, you know exactly what that is. So as long as someone gave it good descriptions, documentation should be a piece of cake. But if you didn't get good descriptions and every single image you have says Windows 7, you'll have to go in and change those descriptions using image X. Then you can pipe this to a text file, print it off, put it in your documentation book. Let's look at mounting images. Not just mounting and unmounting, but you really need to understand the whole story. The nice thing about mounting an image is we don't have to take an image, blast it out to a target machine, patch that target machine once a month, and then generate a completely new image any longer. So Patch Tuesday is a lot less painful by the fact that we can mount an image, patch that image, unmount the image, and you're done. So something that used to take a day or two, depending on the number of patches that came out, can now take just a matter of hours. The syntax for mounting an image is DISM command, of course, / mount-wim, space, / the WIM file itself, the path and the name of the image file. The image index, as you saw in that last one, we had 5 image indexes, so we have to tell it which one we want to mount. And then the last thing you'll tell it is the mount directory. And here I just have an empty folder that I've created on C called mount. For example, I would type dism mount-wim, tell it the WIM file, colon, where that WIM file is. It's in the WIMs folder. It's named install.wim. Which image inside that WIM file do I want to mount? Well, that's index 5. And then the mount directory, colon, C:\mount. Once an image is mounted, you can get information on all of your mounted images. In fact, one of the really cool things you can do with images is you can mount multiple images and you can copy and paste between them. So any utilities that you just need to slap a file out there, you've got that utility, you can now copy and paste that utility into your mounted image and boom, you're done. Piece of cake. And when you do have multiple images mounted, sometimes it's a good idea to get mounted WIM information just to make sure that everybody's still okay. So to check your status, you would tell it, dism, get mounted WIM info. You're not going to point to a specific WIM file. You're going to say, show me everybody that's currently mounted. And you'll get a set of statuses for each WIM file that's mounted. Your status should be set to OK. That's good. If it's set to needs remount, well, that's going to need a little bit of work. The status for needs remount, first, attempt to use the remount WIM switch. If that doesn't work, you may need to clean up WIM and then remount the WIM. Those look like this. To remount a WIM, dism /remount-WIM, and then tell it where the WIM is currently mounted. So the mount directory, for us, it would have been C:\mount. If that doesn't work and you need to run the cleanup, this one's really easy. You simply type in dism/cleanup-WIM. It doesn't care which WIM you're talking about. You don't point to any specific WIM. It looks at the current status of each one of your WIMs and attempts to clean it up. Now, you might have to go back and run the remount command after you've done cleanup. Here's my first and favorite tip to give people. Don't type this all out. As you've seen already, some of these commands are so long and autocomplete doesn't work, so that's not helpful at all. I like to use dism's help file. This is one of the best written help files I have ever seen. And what I like to do is I like to drill down and get specific information. Let's say I want to find out what's the syntax for mounting a WIM. Instead of just typing dism /? to show me what I can do, I can tell it dism /mount-WIM and then give me a question mark. Well, that gives me some specific examples. But wait, I still don't want to type it. So if I were to type dism, the /mount-WIM, give me the help file, and then pipe that to a text file, well then I could open that text file in Notepad, make a couple small changes, and then copy and paste that into my command prompt. And what you're going to find is you do the same commands over and over and over again. So do yourself a favor when you start working with dism, just go ahead and build this cheat sheet right up front. Have it available for whenever you're going to mount, unmount, add drivers, get list of drivers. You're going to see that it'll take maybe an hour to set up a cheat sheet that you will use repeatedly for a long, long time. It's a lot easier to copy and paste than it is to figure these commands out every single time. Let's go mount a WIM. Back on our deployment server, we'll clear that screen. And I'm going to go ahead and start building my cheat sheet. Mount-WIM, and pipe that out to a text file, put it in C, and let's just call it mw.txt. Notepad, mw.txt, and let's go see what we're going to build first. I'm on the C drive, and we previously created a WinPE environment. So the first thing I'm going to do is use this winpe.wim, and we're going to mount that. So notice it's in the WPE folder. Let's go back to the root of C, There's our mw.txt. We have it open right here. And what we're going to do is first get rid of that .exe. We don't need that. We do need the mount-wim. The wim file is going to be in the WPE folder. Delete all that. And it is winpe.wim. The image index is 1, that's good. But there's this great big empty space there that we want to make sure doesn't have a return in it. If I would have copied and pasted that command into my command prompt, then it would have done the first half of the command, enter, and the second half, enter, and of course it would have failed. The mount directory that I'm going to put it in, I haven't created yet, but I am going to create just a plain mount folder. Now I want to make sure there's nothing unexpected there. So I'll backspace and then put a space in there. Let's copy this command. And in Windows Explorer, notice I don't have a mount folder, so we're going to need that first. There we go. Back at our command prompt. Let's paste that in and press enter. If the command works properly, that's when you want to go back to that WordPad document and grab everything else and just delete it. So the first thing I'm going to do is tell this to mount a WIM. And I don't even need that examples in there. Delete that out as well. Let's put this guy up here. Notice on the second line, what this is showing me is if I wanted to mount an image in a read-only mode, you just need to add the / read-only switch. I don't need that one either, so I'm going to go ahead and get rid of it. Now I want to show you two other commands. We'll start with the dism command, /, and tell it I want to look at a specific image. That image is currently in the C:\/ mount folder, and show me what I can do to it. This looks very similar to when I pointed to the online, but if you go through it with a fine-tooth comb, you'll find there are a couple of additional switches here. So once again, just wanted to show you what it looks like to point it to a specific context. This time, instead of pointing to the online context, I'm pointing to a mounted image. Let's scroll that up to the top. Next, I want to show you what it looks like to use the Get Mounted WIM Info switch. Currently, I only have one image that's mounted. If I had multiple images that were mounted, I would have the same information for each one of those images. So I know that I have an image mounted in the C:\/ folder. The file that's currently mounted is the WPE winpe.wim. Image index is number 1. It's mounted as read-write, and the status right now is OK. So everything looks good. So the operation completed successfully, and we have a status of OK. Now this is a command you're going to use a lot. So I would highly recommend putting that into our Notepad document. And we didn't actually have to pipe that to a text file, but doing it this way, you only have to type it in once. One other thing I like to do is whenever I manually type in a command to my cheat sheet, I don't want to mess around with this later, so I like to copy it, go out and run it, just to make sure I didn't miskey anything. I don't want to spend valuable time later on when I'm in the middle of troubleshooting something, trying to figure out that I misspelled a word or typed something incorrectly. So I think it's a really good idea. Every time you put something into your cheat sheet file, just pop out real quick and see if it'll run. Adding drivers is probably something you're going to do a lot more than other switches like changing the addition. So I wanted to show you how to add drivers from different ways. And what I mean by ways is, look at the first bullet. You can add drivers from a specific folder, and this would add all drivers in that folder. The dism command is to tell it, currently it's an image, where the image is mounted. I have this image mounted in the WinPE mount folder. Tell it to add driver, and then / driver, point to the path and folder name where the drivers reside. That command will add all drivers within a folder. But what if you want it to add all drivers from that folder and all folders within that folder? Well, that's called recursion. So that's your next command. It's the exact same command, but at the end you'll tell it to recurse. If you want to add just one specific driver, you've got to have the INF file for it, and that command, once again, is going to look exactly the same as the first two that we looked at, but on the driver specification, tell it the path and the name of the driver INF file, and that'll choose just that one specific driver. If you're on a 32-bit operating system and you want to force unsigned drivers to be installed, because by default they won't be, your command is the dism image, point to where it's mounted, add driver, give it the driver switch, path, name of the driver you'd like to install, and then the / force unsigned option. Once you've added some drivers, it might be a good idea to get a list of those drivers. In fact, get a list of those drivers and then pipe that information to a text file, print it off, and put it in that good old documentation manual just to keep the boss happy. To get a list of your currently installed drivers, you'll have to mount the image. As you see, here I've got the image mounted in the WinPE mount folder. Then you can type dism image, point to the mount folder, / get drivers. If you don't like the way it formats that, you can also format it in a table format. I like the table format a little bit better, and I'll show you both here in just a minute. To get specific driver information, you don't want to say, just show me all the drivers that have been installed. You would type in dism, image where it's currently mounted, get driver info, tell it the name of the driver exactly that you want to get information on. To remove a driver, instead of get driver, we would tell it to remove a driver and then give it the driver's specific name. And I'm going to show you how when you add drivers, they all get named OEM1, second one is OEM2, third is OEM3, on and on. So getting drivers, first of all, will dump the information for you so you can figure out which driver is the one you'd like to remove. To remove multiple drivers, it's the same command, dism image, point to where it's currently mounted, tell it to remove - driver, and then give it the list of drivers. Driver, there's the first one we want to remove, space, / driver, there's the second one, and on and on and on. Notice there's no commas, colon, semicolon, anything in between those statements. Let's take a look at our drivers and how to document them. Let's see which drivers have currently been added already. So I'll do dism, / image, colon. We've got ours in the mount folder, and I just want it to get the driver information. And as you can see, we haven't added any third-party drivers yet. Let me show you what we're going to add. In Windows Explorer, I have a drivers folder. In that folder, I have just a couple of VMware drivers I'm going to add. We'll minimize that and clear the screen. Now I could type this whole command out, but this one's really not very nice. So I'm going to do dism, and I'm going to cheat a bit. Just tell it, yeah, look at the online image right now, and show me if I wanted to add a driver to it, what would the syntax be for that? And let's go ahead and pipe this out to a text file. I'll just call it drv.txt. Then we'll open good old Notepad. And I'm going to figure out which one do I want here. This is add driver. That's a specific driver, but I could use that one and just point to the folder itself. That's the one I'm going to grab. I'll grab that. We'll copy it. Close that down. Go into our cheat sheet. Control V. We already know that's not supposed to be a break there, so grab that guy and bring it all the way back up. I like to go to the beginning and get rid of those silly characters .exe. We don't need that. Now we'll go to Image. It's currently in the Mount folder. We'll just get rid of all that. We want to tell it to add driver, and we want to add all the drivers that are in the C:\drivers folder. Let's copy that out to our command prompt, paste it in, and hit enter. Shows us found 2 driver packages in that folder. It's installing one of 2, shows you the name, and installing the second. Now let's hit the up arrow to the get drivers command we did previously. Let's see what it shows us this time. Now we have a couple of third-party drivers from our driver store. Let's see, the first one is named OEM0.inf. Well, that's helpful. What's the second one named? OEM1. If you look at the class, we know it's a network driver. If you look at the provider name, that's the information you want to look at to figure out which driver it is you want to remove, if you choose to remove drivers. Now, in a production environment, you're probably going to have more than 2 drivers in your images. In fact, you're probably going to end up with lots and lots of drivers in your images. And documenting them by piping this information out to a text file, well, it's not going to be as pretty as if we told it to get drivers, but I want you to format it in a table format. That's a lot easier to read. So what we could do is take that, pipe it to a text file, C:\drivers, txt, open it using Notepad, and as you can see, much cleaner. Isn't that a lot nicer? Print that off, put it in your book, just call it documentation. Packages are next. To get package information on an existing WIM file, well, first of all, of course, you're going to have to mount it. Then you'll want to run the dism image, tell it where it's mounted. Ours is currently mounted in the Mount folder, /get packages. If you'd like to add packages for other types of scripting support, let's say a WinPE, for example, by default, they only have support for XML scripts to be run. If I have a script that's possibly a WMI script, I need to add the package support, or that script will not be able to run in my WinPE. We currently have a WinPE mounted, so to add package support to the mounted WinPE, the command would look like this. dism /image mount folder, add package, and then give it the package path. It's not pretty, it's a big, long package path, and make sure it's in quotes. The WinPE feature packs is where all of the WinPE pre-built packages can be found. Then, once you've added it, I think it's always a good idea to list the packages again to make sure that it lists it as being an installed package. Let's take a peek at packages. Back on our deployment server. We'll clear that screen. Let's first go to that Notepad cheat sheet. I'm going to type in the dism command, image, currently C:\mount, and get packages. We'll copy that, minimize our Notepad document, deployment tools, paste it in, and press enter. By default, you'll see that we have WinPE language pack installed, and we have a WinPE package. The state is install pending. Don't concern yourself with that. The release type, this is a foundation, this is a language pack, and this is the time that it was actually installed. To install a package, this isn't something you're going to do often, so I wouldn't recommend putting it in the cheat sheet. I would just accept the pain of having to type it in one time. This is what it's going to look like. DISM, image, currently mounted in that C:\mount folder. What we'd like to do is add a package. That package path is C:\program files /wake /tools /PE tools. I have a 32-bit WinPE mounted, so I'm going to add the 32-bit package going to the x86 folder /. Then I'm in the WinPE _FP for feature pack, and it is plural / WinPE-WMI.cab. End quote, and press enter. And what a perfect example of why we don't like typing these long, ugly DISM commands. Just a simple glance at that command, and I can see that I've told it to add the WinPE, which is incorrect. I'm going to go back up, tell it to change that M to an N, and I'm actually going to take a second to go back and double check. DISM /image, it is in the mount folder. We want to add a package. That package path is open, close quotes, got them both, C:\program files, wake, tools, PE tools, x86, WinPE _FPs, WinPE-WMI. I usually type in WIM. That's a big one for me. WMI.cab. Let's try that again. And that looks a lot better. At least it found the package that time. Now it's adding the WMI package to my WinPE, so I'll be able to boot that WinPE and run WMI scripts. Once it's completed successfully, I like to cursor up a couple times and tell it to get packages one more time for me. All right, now it shows that I have a third package that has been installed, date and time, and WinPE WMI package support. If you arrow up once more, pipe that out to a text file, we'll call it packages.txt. Open it using Notepad. Print that, put it in your documentation book. You now know how to use DISM, how to point to a specific context, and how to add drivers, packages, get lists of drivers, packages, format them in any way you'd like. That format table switch works with anything, so choose whichever format you'd like to see it in to print that off and put it in your documentation book. And that wraps up the information for DISM. The next section is on the User State Migration Tool, or USMT 4.0. The USMT process. We have an XP machine and a deployment server. The first thing you need to do for your USMT process to work correctly is upgrade your applications. Now, big picture here, you're going to take all of your data, user settings, and application settings from that XP machine, and you're going to either store them locally or you're going to store all of that on a deployment server. Then you're going to apply it to the machine after you've installed Windows 7. So you need to make sure that you have the latest and greatest applications on your XP machine, because as you'll see a little bit later on, migrating settings from an older version of an application to newer versions doesn't always work, and it's application specific as to where the application put its stuff, like which folders it created, which registry keys it edited. So make sure, number one, upgrade all your applications on that XP machine. And this is the same for Vista, or if you're migrating from Windows 7 as well. Step 2, you'll run the USMT scan state utility, and this is where you can decide if you're going to store the data and the user settings and application settings on the local XP machine, or if you want to put it on a server across the network. Now, why would you do one over the other? That's where hard links are going to come into play for us. And let me just mention the refresh and replace scenarios. In a refresh scenario, you're refreshing the operating system on an existing piece of hardware. You're going to keep that physical computer. In a replace scenario, you're not going to keep that physical computer. You're going to gather the user's data, then you're going to toss that machine away, install Windows 7, and then reapply the user's data settings and application settings. So in a replace scenario, you couldn't store this information locally because then you're going to toss it out the door. Wouldn't do you any good to store it locally. So in a refresh scenario, definitely store the data locally if you'd like to. When we get to hard links, I'll explain a little bit more about that. If you know you're going to replace that physical computer, you have no choice but to store the data across the network on a deployment server. Step 3 is to install Windows 7 on that old XP machine. Step 4, install your applications. This is a very, very important point. USMT does not reinstall the applications themselves, only application settings. So you still have to install your applications on the Windows 7 machine. Once your applications are installed, you can then run USMT's load state command to put all the user's data, settings, and application settings on your new Windows 7 machine. The operating systems that are supported. Well, the first thing I should tell you is USMT is command line driven. There are two utilities that come with it. Scan state, that scans and gathers all the user's data, and then there's load state, that puts the data back on a machine. Notice, XP, both 32 and 64-bit, scan state is supported, but not load state. On everything after that, Vista and Windows 7, both 32 and 64-bit, scan state and load state are both supported. What is and isn't supported? Well, you can migrate a 32-bit operating system to a 64-bit OS, no problems there, but you can't go the opposite direction. You can't migrate a 64-bit OS to a 32-bit OS. You can migrate from XP, SP2, or later, and it's important for you to know that USMT is not supported on any server operating system at all. It won't even run. It's also not supported on starter editions of Windows XP, Vista, or Windows 7. The requirements for a successful USMT migration are that you have to run this as an administrator and from an elevated command prompt. If you're not familiar with elevated command prompts, you would want to right-click the command prompt and choose Run as Administrator. If you need to provide administrative credentials, go ahead, type in an administrator username and password. Or if you log on as an account that is not an administrator account, the only profile, data, settings, and application settings that will be migrated will be the ones of the user you logged on as. So logging on as an administrator grabs every profile, all users' data, and all application settings. So to keep things simple, I always log on as administrator. There are two types of migrations that can be performed, online and offline. Online means you have a full-blown operating system up and running, like XP or Vista or Windows 7. Offline means you have a computer that has one of those operating systems on it, but you've booted that computer into a WinPE. Or if you've upgraded an older machine to, let's say, Vista or Windows 7, you would now have a Windows.old folder. You could also perform an offline migration from that Windows.old folder. Now, what's good and bad about the offline migrations? Well, first of all, it's going to run faster because it's not a full-blown operating system, so you don't have as many services running or processes in the background. You won't have any problem with files that are currently locked because another process is using them because, once again, you don't have as many processes that are running. And Windows PE automatically boots with administrator privileges. So the person who's running your migration doesn't have to know a local administrator account in order to perform the migration. But One of the problems with offline migrations are not everything gets migrated. And I'm going to show you a little bit later on when we talk about what does and doesn't get migrated. I've put asterisks beside everything that will not be migrated in an offline scenario. There are 3 built-in scripts that USMT uses by default. miguser.xml, and that contains all the rules needed to migrate your default user profiles and data. It really describes a core migration scenario. The migapp.xml, that holds all the rules for migrating your application settings. And migdocs.xml, that defines which data is supposed to be migrated. Let's start out with miguser.xml. The folders that will be migrated by default are My Documents, My Video, My Music, My Pictures, Desktop Files, the Start menu, whatever's on it, your Quick Launch settings, and Favorites. As for profiles, on an XP machine, your All Users profile will be migrated. And on Vista and Windows 7, you have a public profile that contains shared documents, video, music, some desktop files, pictures, your Start menu, and Favorites. Those are all migrated using the default USMT settings. The types of files, by default, that are migrated are all of these extensions, and wherever you see the asterisk, I'm using that as a wildcard, so one or more characters can be appended to what I'm showing you here. I'm not going to go through the entire list, but the important thing to note is all fixed drives are searched by default. But any files outside of the user profile that don't match those file extensions, and come on, how many times have you been called out to a user's desk because they created some really important file, they chose file save, yes, went to lunch, came back and said, oh my gosh, where did I put that? We've all been there. Even things at the root of C will get migrated, as I'll show you in the demo a little bit later on. But the point here is only data by default that has the previous file extensions are the ones that will be migrated. And before you even ask, yes, of course, you can customize and add to or remove whatever file extensions you'd like. Also, any data residing on USB hard disks, flash drives, that also gets migrated, as well as any data on a mapped network drive. Operating system settings that are migrated. Well, accessibility settings, the address book, command prompt settings if you've changed those, desktop wallpaper, notice here's your first asterisk. This is a setting that will not be migrated if you're doing an offline migration. So, desktop wallpaper only if you're doing an online migration. Then, any encrypted files, EFS files, favorites, folder options, fonts, users, groups, and group memberships, your Windows IE settings, another one that doesn't get migrated in an offline scenario, your Microsoft ODBC settings, mouse, keyboard settings, any mapped network drives you have. Then we have a few that won't be migrated if performing offline. Network printer mapping, offline files, phone and modem options, regional settings. Then you have your RAS connection and book files and remote access settings. And the last of the settings, taskbar settings, Windows Mail, Microsoft Outlook Express mail files, Windows Media Player, and Windows Rights Management. You've noticed there a couple of those aren't available offline either. Operating system settings that are not migrated by default. Any local printers, hardware-related settings, drivers and passwords, application binary files, synchronization files if you're doing offline files, any DLLs, executables, permissions on shared folders do not get migrated. The fact that it's a shared folder will get migrated, but the permissions will no longer be there. Your language has to match. You cannot migrate from a Swedish-based machine to an English machine. Also, your customized icons for shortcuts and taskbar settings when you're migrating from XP are not migrated. Moving into the migapps.xml settings. Now, I'm not going to read these, But I do want to make sure that you know these are the application settings that will be migrated once again, not the application. The application will not be migrated. You must reinstall it once you have your Windows 7 machine up and running. But I wanted you to have a complete listing of all the application settings and the version of the application that by default will be migrated for you. And here's the last of the applications that will be migrated by default. Now, there is a special scenario here, and that's Microsoft Office. Normally, you cannot migrate application settings from an older version to a new version. Well, that is except for Microsoft Office. USMT can migrate from an earlier version to a later version. So if your users are currently running Office 2007, don't worry, everything's fine. You'll be able to migrate those settings into Office 2010 when you deploy Windows 7 and Office 2010. And one note, Microsoft project settings, well, they're not migrated if you're migrating from Office 2003 to Office 2007. When migrating from XP, there's a couple of gotchas. Your internet connection sharing setting is not migrated. The reason is because the Windows 7 setting is more secure. So if you had turned this setting off, ICS, in XP, migrating that setting into the Windows 7 environment could make that computer less secure. Also, on your firewall advanced configuration settings, like port exceptions that you've created, are not migrated because of the same reason. They could increase security risks to that machine. And the last note is once you've migrated from XP to Windows 7, that network connections user interface, it might not refresh properly. So if you don't see any NICs, go ahead and hit F5 to refresh the screen. If that doesn't work, log off, log back on, go look at them again. Don't troubleshoot this all day long. It's a known issue. Let's look at how USMT actually works. Number one, you're going to log on as administrator. Then you need to copy the USMT folder to your local machine so you can run USMT. You're going to run it from an elevated command prompt. If you want to calculate the disk space storage needs, now think about this for a second. If you have 5 users and you have terabytes of hard drive space on a server, probably not a big deal as to how much data is going to be stored. But what happens when you have 500 machines that you need to migrate? Now you do need to be concerned with how much storage space is this going to cost me if I store my USMT data on a server. To calculate that, each machine requires 250 megs of space. Then, on that local machine, you can run scan state with the /P switch, tell it to create a report, and it will tell you how much storage space is required for that one computer. Then, if most of your users are average users, you can just multiply by that one user's amount of storage space against the number of computers you have out there. That should give you a general idea. If you work in an environment where you've got 50 users that are using CAD files and you have other users that have tons and tons and tons of music files or large graphic files, whatever it might be, you may have to calculate the disk space storage needs for each of those machines individually to make sure you don't run out on your server if you are storing the USMT's information on a server. Once you've figured out if you have enough space to store the data, you'll gather users' data settings and application settings. This is called something special. It's called user's state. The user state is put into something that we call a migration store. There are 3 different types of migration stores. We have a compressed, which is the default. The compressed is a .mig file. Now you can encrypt it and protect it with a password if you choose, but by default, this is just a MIG file that has compressed information about all the user's data, settings, and application settings. You cannot open this file in Notepad, WordPad, or Doc and read it. It's not legible. Uncompressed, that's an actual mirror image of the folder hierarchy that's going to be migrated. The settings are going to be stored in a catalog file, and it'll also describe how to restore the files on the destination machine. If you create an uncompressed migration store, you can open this and cruise through it and look at the data, files, and application settings. The third type of migration store is a hard link migration store. This is a map that gets created on the local machine when you run the ScanState utility, and it actually maps out where the data lives, and that data cannot be moved. It will not be moved. So HardLink creates a map of where your data currently resides and all the other settings. Those will not be moved. When you replace the operating system on that machine with the new operating system, that data will still reside physically on the same sectors of that hard drive. Which leads us to one more point. I like to format the drive in between operating systems. It's not often that you get to go out and just level the whole playing field and start from scratch. I'm a big believer in formatting the hard drive in between operating systems. If you've run USMT and told it to store the data locally using hard links, and then you format the drive, well, your hard links are gone. So if you do use hard links, you cannot format that hard drive. For gathering the user's data and settings, the command line utility we're going to use is ScanState. Running ScanState, you'll do it from an elevated command prompt, and it can be a very simple syntax that you choose to use. ScanState, C:\\, and let's tell it where we're going to store the data. So we could tell it to ScanState, store it in a folder named USMT. We could tell it, ScanState, store it in the folder USMT, and just do the auto, or really the default settings. If you'd like to use hard link, you can tell it to do auto and store it locally using hard links and no compress. Or you can get really granular and come up with a huge ScanState command that looks like a paragraph, like this one. This is running ScanState, and it's going to store the information in the mini-nt folder, state store. The verbosity level is set to 5. As you can see, we're doing hard links and no compress. We are also migrating encrypted files with the EFS switch, and we're telling it to include the MIG app XML, MIG docs XML, and then there's a couple of log files, the USMT capture log and the USMT capture.prg. So as you can see, you can make your ScanState statement as easy or as involved as you need it to be for your environment. A note on user accounts. By default, all user accounts are migrated, including local user accounts. So running ScanState, putting everything into the USMT folder in auto, will gather user state for all accounts, local as well as any domain accounts that have logged on to that machine. Let's take a look at running USMT. Now I am going to run ScanState and LoadState on Windows 7 machines because that's what we've built so far. But let me show you first of all what we have. We go into Windows Explorer. I'll show you in the root of C. Look at that. I've got some PowerPoints and a Office XML doc out there. Then in my Documents folder, logged on as the Rhonda account, I have, some Excel spreadsheets, some Word documents, a PNG image, and, another XML document. Let's take a look at the local user accounts that are on this machine. We'll expand local users and groups, highlight users. I have a Rhonda account and a Megan account. I'd like for those to be migrated. To do this, close this down, go back into the C drive. The first thing we need to do is copy the USMT folder from our deployment server, the one where we have installed the Windows Automated Installation Kit. Any machine you install the Wake on will also give you the USMT files. It doesn't have to be a server, just happens to be a server in our environment. To map a drive, we'll right-click Network and tell it to map network drive. The drive letter, we'll go ahead and stick with Z, and the folder, input the IP address. And I shared this folder as USMT files. I'm going to tell it to connect using different credentials since I'm in a work group on this machine. Click Finish, input my domain credentials, And what we're looking at here, we just want to highlight everything, tap Control C. I'm going to go to the C drive, create a new folder, and just to keep things simple, I'm going to name this USMT. We'll go into that folder and paste everything locally. Now we're ready to run USMT. We'll close Windows Explorer, start an elevated command prompt, accessories, right-click, tell it to run as administrator. Good old UAC, yes, I know you're going to use my admin token, that's cool. Shows us we're at the administrator command prompt, and I want to change directories. In fact, I'm going to change directories into that USMT folder. And before I run the scan state utility, I want to store this on my deployment server because I'm going to load state it to another machine. So before I run scan state, I need to go ahead and map a drive. We'll just call it the U drive. And the USMT folder. The name is administrator. Now I can run scan state, tell it to put it on the U drive, the USMT folder, and run auto. When scan state has completed, what you want to see is return code of 0, which means no errors happened. But what did we actually get? Let's go take a look at our server and open Windows Explorer. We'll go to the F drive, which is where I created the USMT folder. We open that. We now see that that machine created a USMT folder within the USMT folder. This folder was previously empty. We open that, we'll see the USMT folder, and this is your compressed migration store. Go ahead, try to open it. I promise, if you do get it open, it won't be pretty. So, our scan state has worked properly for the migration. If you would like to migrate only the local files, you don't want the data off the USB flash drives or your network drives, you can add the local only switch. Your scan state command would look like this. Scan state, tell it we're going to put it in the USMT. This scenario is storing it locally. You could also tell it the U drive as we just did, auto, and local only. Then you just get the data that's on all your local fixed drives. Applying user state. Well, once again, another command line utility, and it's called load state. You have to run it from an elevated command prompt, and the load state statements are identical to what you did with the scan state most of the time. So I could do load state and just point to where I want it to grab data from. I can run the easiest option of just telling it to do auto. And if you previously ran scan state with the hard link switch, you'll need to run load state with the hard link switch as well. And whenever you use the hard link switch, you have no choice here. You must use the no compress switch. Those two go hand in hand. One won't work without the other. And as we did with the scan state command, I wanted to make sure you had the equivalent load state command. So that really involved scan state command equates to this really involved load state command. I'm not going to go through this line by line, but just know that pretty much whatever you do in a scan state is what you want to reverse engineer in your load state to get the correct data. Now, a note on those local user accounts. Remember we said a scan state auto will migrate all user accounts, even your local user accounts. But when you run load state, you have to tell it that you want to load those local user accounts onto the new destination machine. You do that by running load state, tell it where that store was placed. We could give it auto and then LAC for local accounts. You want those to be loaded back up on the destination machine. Now, running that command by itself is great. It creates the user accounts, but it disables the user accounts. If you'd like to create the user accounts and enable them, you'll run load state, point to where you've put your user's store, still using the auto switch, and this time LAC space /LAE for local accounts enabled will enable those local user accounts. Let's take a look at how we can load that USMT data on a completely different machine. In my virtual environment, we ran scan state from our Windows 7 machine. I'm now going to power that guy off. We'll close him. And I'm going to open and I can open the new Windows 7 machine, power it on. On my brand new Windows 7 machine, let's first go into Windows Explorer. We'll take a look at the root of C. Don't have any files there. Documents, I don't have any files. What user accounts do I have on this machine? Let's go in and manage the computer. Expand local users and groups and highlight users. Notice on this machine I only have Lindsay as a user account. Let's close computer management. And we need to map two network drives. So let's do this. Let's map a network drive. I'll accept Z. Give it the IP address. Don't want it to reconnect at logon, and I'll connect using different credentials. Those are our USMT files. I'm going to right click. As you can see, Windows Security is turned on. I'll copy. We'll go to the C drive, create a new folder, name it USMT just to keep this really simple. Open that folder and then paste all those files into it so I can run this locally. The next drive I need to map is to get access to those USMT files I stored earlier running the scan state utility. So let's map a network drive, and this time I'm going to map it to the U drive. USMT folder. Within that, the USMT folder. Connect using different credentials and finish. Now we are logged on as an administrator with that Lindsay account. We need to launch an elevated command prompt, so all programs, accessories, right-click, choose to run as administrator. Yes, we're aware our admin token is going to be used. To run that load state command, we have to change directories into the USMT folder. Then we can run load state, tell it where our migration store is. It's on the U drive in the USMT folder, and I want to give it the LAC to create those local accounts, and I want to make those enabled. Press enter. When the load stand completes and you have a return code of 0, it's time to go check out and see exactly what's happened. Let's close that command prompt, go into Windows Explorer, expand the computer, highlight the C drive, and oh, look at that! The files that I had stored in the root of C on the other drive have shown up here. If we go into the Users folder, we now see there's a Megan folder and a Rhonda folder, which tells me that those accounts got created, but let's close this down and just go double check. Look at Manage the Computer and expand Local Users and Groups, highlight users, and as you can see, both the Megan account and the Rhonda account have been created and are enabled. All right, looks good to me. And that wraps up running scan state and taking that migration store to a new machine and running load state on it. That's USMT in a nutshell. In this session, we started out with the Deployment Image Servicing and Management, or DISM, basics. Talked a little bit about terminology where we had to figure out what looking at an image with context and without context actually meant, and what it meant to the difference in the help files and what we could do to those images. Then we got into mounting images, getting information on images, and when we got tired of typing out those great big long DISM commands, I showed you how to easily pipe those commands to a text file, create a cheat sheet, because you're going to do the same commands over and over and over again, store it as a notepad file, and just make sure it's easily accessible to any place where you're going to be running DISM commands. I'd put it on a USB and just keep it with me. Then I showed you how to add and remove drivers, not just add and remove drivers, but also how to document those drivers and get the output in a couple of different types of lists. By default, it's going to scroll and just show you a little bit of information about each driver. I like the table format for documentation purposes. Then we switched gears and went into the User State Migration Tool, or USMT version 4.0. We talked about the processes and the requirements. I went over the difference between a refresh scenario and replace scenario when using USMT. If you put your migration store on that local machine, it's not going to be helpful in a replace scenario when you're replacing the physical computer with a new computer. So in a replace scenario, you want to make sure that you put your user's store on a server across the network where you can access it from another machine. We also talked about the requirements and the importance of logging on as an administrator account so that you migrate all users' profiles and data, not just the one you log on as. I think understanding what gets migrated and what doesn't get migrated is every bit as important. So I spent a little bit of time explaining the difference between an online migration and an offline migration, pros and cons, and which settings will get migrated in which scenario, online versus offline. Then we wrapped it up with how USMT stores the data in the migration stores and how you can choose which migration store type you would like to use. I showed you some sample scan state, load state utilities, and then did a quick demo to show you how I could migrate user accounts and data from one Windows 7 machine using scan state to another using load state. I think you're now ready to manage your images using DISM and take care of your user's data, settings, and application settings using USMT.